Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Stand Alone, where we meet with the best of the best. What does it mean to stand alone? This is not about isolation. This is not about being alone. It is about how do I go from being ordinary to extraordinary? There are things that you have to do to stand apart. There are things that you have to do in terms of walking with conviction. And the way that we get better at these skills of being courageous in our journey of leadership is we've got to have conversations with other people that demonstrate leadership qualities. And so today I have a very, very special guest with us, Jaime Diglio. So, Jaime, I had to print out all the things that you've accomplished, but I love that first you're the founder of inFirst Coaching. So we're going to talk about today, where is business and sales and leadership going? Because it's not the same, it's changing. And then we have to change. You have 20 years in corporate sales. You've been a sales coach for Harvard Business School. You have 10 plus years of back-to-back being a top achiever. So it's not someone who failed in business that's now giving us advice, because we don't want anything to do with that. A lot of people have that. You've built, an over $40 million a year business, managing over 500 million in revenue. So these are massive accomplishments. And then, you have a master's degree in organizational psychology. What I love is what you're doing right now, where you're taking AI data-driven insight and you're applying behavioral science, you're applying psychological strategies to help leaders become better, to understand what's really happening in their organization, which is what business is. Like, we've got to understand people. And so a lot of the conversations I'm having today for people that want to be top performers is it's not just about you being ambitious. You've got to learn how to connect and deal with people. Because I don't know if you agree with me or not, Jaime, but I think we're getting better as humans at sniffing out who's authentic and who's a fraud. Like, and we don't want to have any room for that anymore. So what we want to do is sharpen our people skills, but then we also have to sharpen our skills, get better as human beings. So we're going to dive into this today. Congratulations on your new book, Moneyball Leadership, which I just recently read, and we're going to go into that today. But I want to just open up by asking, what made you pivot in your sales journey? Because you started off in sales, and sales is very rewarding. But then you saw like something happened to you, if you can talk about this, where there was a shift where you said, I want to not just change what I'm doing, but I want to change the game that I'm playing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here with you. So I mean, I can start with. I actually didn't start in sales.
Okay.
I mean, I have had a sales career, but I actually started out my career in marketing.
Love it.
Back when I went to school, they didn't really have a sales program. I didn't even think about sales as a career. But
Yeah.
what happened was I ended up in marketing, and before I even so my one of my first jobs was at Gartner, and that's where I spent 13 years of my career at Gartner, growing new businesses there. But I didn't start in the sales. I started in the marketing, and what I realized, because I would do events, I would do marketing of events, and I would be at events with customers. And I would see all these customers that were like, they didn't know where they're supposed to be going. They needed help. And so I just noticed that I just leaned into wanting to be curious, like, hey, how can I help you here? What are you trying to do? And so I just naturally was like, hey, I think this sales thing is something that I would be really good at, because I wanted to be able to take action, right, and help someone to, achieve a goal. And so ironically, I took a step back. I was in a manager level position, and I went back to a very junior sales position to step into sales. So a lot of people think, oh, I always have to just go up. I'm like, no, sometimes you have to go down to go back up
Love
when
that.
it comes, yeah, right. And so pivot. And yeah, and so that it just kind of naturally happened. I mean, and I didn't have, like, without having a sales background, I kind of stepped into it. And what I had was my ability to listen, be curious, understand the problem, right? And in the beginning, like, I was working in technology, and working with a lot of financial services and insurance companies, and they're talking about all this stuff. I had no idea what they were talking about. And I would write it down, but then I would go, okay, so what was most important? What is most important that you need to solve that you can't solve? And so then I go back and I do my research and figure it out. And it's like, when you think about anything, it's like anything in life. I think one of the biggest changes is we want to hack for everything. Today, we want the instant hack and understanding how to be better.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, it's about practice. We're practicing every time, every interaction, we're practicing. And I think that that's when, to your question about like what's changed and shifted within, for leaders and in sales, is that we instantly want the result. And when
Right.
we don't get it, we think, oh, it's the person or whatever. And we're not thinking more about the foundational practice. What are the practices of how we're showing up, in every conversation, every opportunity, right? A lot of people say, oh, I'm not in sales. And my argument is we're all in sales. Every conversation is a sales conversation.
Yeah.
And in every conversation, you're either making money or losing money. And the key to that, which I think is something that leaders need to shift and understand, it starts first with your self-awareness in how you're engaging in every conversation. And so many are so unself-aware and they're just talking, but nobody's listening. And
Yeah.
so there's a
I've seen this.
shift there.
Yeah. One of the great things to do in leadership is just to sit, listen, and watch. And I've always been like an observation type of person. So I can be very quiet and be just paying attention to what's going on, taking in the information. And you talk about this in your book, which I think is so incredibly important for people to understand. Like, what are your listening capabilities? Not just pretending to be quiet to let someone talk while you're preparing what to say, but are you really paying, tuning in to what is important to people so that you can then deliver that to them? Um, in one of your one paragraph, just to kick this off, like what is the differences in businesses of the past versus like where we're going in the future? And I love this little paragraph, and I would just like to read it to everyone from your book so that people can understand what is the shift that we're talking about that has to take place for leaders, especially in business today. You say the world of work has shifted dramatically in the last 20 years. The people who taught you how to lead the way you do today were probably joining the workforce in the 1980s, 1990s, or maybe earlier. Leadership back then looked like a guy in the corner office of a 40-story building with his feet up on a mahogany desk, smoking a cigarette with his female secretary on his lap. He spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder, and there he sits, the king of the world. I love this. I love this so much because I see this all the time. When I tell people what I do, they're like, "Oh, you're in insurance. Okay, that's great." And then I said, "Yeah, I've been in it for almost 20 years." They're like, "You've been in insurance for 20 years, you're a leader?" Even what leaders look like today is so different. So then now how I was trained though is by amazing tough leaders, and I had to learn how to navigate, like how to become tough but not too tough because people can't handle the toughness anymore. But
Right.
then I'm always doing it from a place of deep love. And I don't think people understand that. And that's what really matters. I wanted for us to really dive into this today. It's not that you're saying for people to be soft. It's not that you're saying like those ways of lack of accountability can't be there. We have to be accountable. We have to be strong and convicted in the way that we work, but you have to be a good person, aware of like why you're doing what you're doing. And that's what you're talking about with self-awareness. And you
Right.
said something powerful. Leadership isn't what you do when you're at work, it's who you are.
Mhm.
Can you elaborate on this? Because I think this is where the real work is.
Yes. Well, and you asked this before, like sort of what pivoted me in my career. I was a successful sales leader. And what happened to me was I lost myself. And that, when I say I lost myself, was it actually happened is we hear a lot about like stress and we hear a lot about, how that impacts the body, but we don't really talk about it. And so for me, it actually, the whole turning point, the reason why I'm here talking to you right now is because one day I was meeting with a hedge fund client. I was having lunch and I lost feeling in the lower half of my body. I couldn't feel my legs. And it was obviously a very traumatic moment in my time in my life where I didn't know what was wrong with me. I had two young kids, and so I ended up in the hospital for a couple days. They did all the tests, and what they said was that it was stress. It was a stress response in my body. And I was like, what do you mean stress? Like, I work out, I'm pretty healthy. And this happened. It was like I felt like I was walking around on toothpicks. It was like a whole thing for me. And at the time, this was back almost 10 years ago. So I didn't like know what to do. And I didn't want to tell anybody because I was afraid that that would make me look weak. Yeah, that I didn't know how to manage my mind. And here's the thing, is like what I realized was, and I talk about this in my TED talk and I talk about it in the book, is that I was living in what I call my own war room. And what war stands for is working against results. It's where it's the mindset where we self-sabotage. It's the where we focus on our weaknesses. We worry about all, what everybody else thinks. And we are wired, right, to focus on fear and like in risk. And so we get very, very comfortable living in our what I call our war room. But on the other side of our brain is what I call our win room. And our win room is where we focus on what I need. It's where we're clear on our values, our strengths, our boundaries, the direction we're going in. And every moment of the day, we're in one of these two rooms, right? We're like, and so why I share this is because I didn't even know I was living there, and I had to figure out how to get out of it.
Mhm.
And so everything I teach today was because I went through it, and it starts here. It starts with understanding yourself and noticing, like how you're talking to yourself. How do you manage that? If you want to be successful, you want to be at peak performance, you can't be living in the war room. And today we have so many people stuck there because that is what many leaders have been trained to focus on control and fear and not on connection and clarity. And so that was the pivot for me where I was realizing I wasn't getting what I needed and I had to figure out a way to get out of it for me to be able to lead my team continuously. So I started all these practices and started really understanding mindset and my own mindset and giving myself, different techniques. And then I practiced that with my teams. And I would see that when I would do these practices that I do with my clients, they're exponentially, they get better because they're more confident in who they are. They find their foundation, their winning formula. And this was like, it was just this, again, it just happened to me. And I was like, I need to figure out how to work my way out of it. And so once I started telling people about what I do and how I do it, they're like, well, I struggle with that too. And then all the stories of people saying, that they're underwater and they're in anxiety and they're stressed all the time and they don't know how to get, they're unhappy. And I'm like, you're not going to have productive people if they're, not happy here first.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about just how people process stress. I think in my experience, I've seen that people can handle different levels of stress and that it manifests differently in what we can handle. But I think it's very important for people to acknowledge that, don't compare yourself to other people. Some people can handle more stress than others. And then, we do these like blanket statements of like, this is a bad environment, this is toxic. But I just wanted to talk about that today because I know there's a lot of people that just make blanket statements and say it's all wrong. And that's not what you're doing here. You're like you're taking the time to understand behaviors, to understand the science behind it. and then having individual conversations with people. So it's not, just this is all bad. I think that's a very, very important thing to talk about today, because there's a
Mhm.
lot of people that are not handling certain things right. And we are like, we're killing off a lot of things. Like we could be suffering in business, then it's like trickling into our personal life, then it's affecting
Yes.
our health. So how do we compartmentalize and not compare ourselves? Because I think that is the root cause of
Mhm.
all of these stresses that we're holding inside of ourselves. And it's manifesting differently in other people, but we
Yeah.
have to stop comparing. Like, can we talk
Yes.
about that?
Yes. And we are in a world, right? We see the highlight reel,
Yes.
everybody's highlight reel, the edited version, not the real reel. And so what happens, and I talked about this in the book, and I actually talked about this in my TED talk, is that we tend to, get stuck. The things that get us stuck in the war room and like doubting ourselves and stress are lack of clarity, comparison, and just not knowing the direction we want to go in. So, the head trash, we hold on to this head trash and we see what everybody else is doing. And our brains are wired to not notice what we are already doing, but then over focus on what everybody else is doing. So I could be doing all these other things, my direction where I'm going, but then if I get attached and see, oh, this person's doing this, maybe I should be doing this. That
Yeah.
person's doing that. We become like squirrels, right? Because we're seeing everybody else's choices, but we're not seeing the ones we've already committed to. And this is what gets us overwhelmed and drowning. And so the way to not do it is to first notice that you're doing it, right? And most people are chasing after all these other things that they think are going to create happiness or success or wealth because they haven't actually sat down to get clarity on what they want.
Yeah.
They haven't done the work. And that's the work that we do, is to hone in what is that? What's the 20%? And that's where I talk about like your winning formula. That's your money ball, right? Like that, what's the 20% that is uniquely you and the direction you want to go in, that is aligned with your strengths, that is aligned to your values, that is your path for success. And once we can hone in on that, we can drop the 80% that's weighing you down, making you all worried and just overthinking. And this is all about measuring what matters to you, and that's as an individual, as a leader. But the same thing within, with a company, is thinking about, we measure everything, we have data for everything, but we're drowning in it, but we're not measuring the one thing. If you're a leader of a team, you could have all this data on them, but the thing you're not measuring is what motivates them, what drives them, the individuals on your team. And so what we want to do is we want to help them understand themselves as an individual. Each person has their own individual drivers, motivations, strengths. And once we can hone in on that and do that work, they exponentially become more effective in their job, in their life. They feel better because they think better, and then they perform better.
Yeah, I can't stress this enough. People always ask me, like, how do you deal with things? I'm just so super focused on understanding myself and running my race. Like, I
Yes.
do not get distracted on what Joe is doing over there, because
Right.
I don't even want to be Joe. Like, I want to be me. So
Right.
I have to be on this mission and I'm not going to pay attention. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. It doesn't mean I don't like Joe. It's
Right.
just that is separate from me. And
Mhm.
so when you talk about this and people say things like know thyself, this is incredibly important. You talked about this, about like doing the self inquiry and asking yourself these questions of what kind of human being do I want to be? I think these are great questions. Then what is my vision exactly? Like, how clearly can I describe the life that I want to live? And then just, am I the kind of leader that I need, or what kind of leader do I need to become to make these visions happen? what do you do in a company first? Do you go in at the individual level and then go into the mission? Or do you do mission first and then the individual?
So most companies, great question. So most companies have their own vision and mission and values. And one of the challenges is that the leadership is like, why are we not aligning to that? And it's because often, or almost always, they've never really shown the individual how they tie to that bigger mission. There's always a linkage. So what we typically will be brought into a company to specifically work with their leaders, either their new leaders, their next in line leaders, and depending on the scenario, and or their sales teams in combination, right? And so what we're doing is we're understanding like where from the leadership whether they think that they need to improve upon. Oftentimes what they think they need is actually that their employees need is actually not what they need. And so part of this about measuring what matters is that we use the program to get to the individual, understanding their motivations, their drivers, the self data, really understanding at the prescriptive level, what is it that, what is success for them? What does that look like? What's their win room? And then we get them focused there and that clarity. And so it not only is empowering and bringing forward that individual, because we're doing that work with them where they're finally feeling seen and heard and valued for who they are. And they see how how they have a competitive advantage because of their own individual strengths and values and drivers. So doing this work, this individual work and we do it in group, we do it in a combination of in group settings. So it's scalable, but also with individual coaching. And it helps the person to reframe and start measuring what matters to them. And once we can articulate that and get clear on that, everything that we learn from the data on the people that go through the program. So if it's a whole leadership team, right, we're taking all that data and then we're using it to inform the organization on what are the areas where they actually do need more training or growth skills. No, but not just doing like what most organizations do. It's like spaghetti on the wall, right? Like just throw this training at them
Yeah.
and it never sticks and they don't understand why. It's because we can't be doing everything one size fits all. We want to scale people, and I talk about this in the book. It's like if we make everybody the same, we basically lower our average. And we leave so much money on the table because each individual that you have in your organization, each leader, they have their unique strengths that once they step into them, they exponentially become better at what they do. But what has been taught to most leaders is about, no, let's make everybody the same. We want you to say the same script over and over again. And that's why you get leaders, you get employees that they have lost themselves. They're unengaged. They're not effective. It's because you've stripped away the 20% that is the thing that makes them so unique and good at what they do.
So, if we can talk about this, because, for when you're training people, the other thing is like structure and systems so that it's not just everybody do their own thing. So if you can talk
Right.
about that, we still need to have structure. We still
Yes.
need to have systems. A script is like a blueprint. It's a guideline,
Right.
but that doesn't mean like you're handcuffed to that and you can't, veer off track. But if you
Right.
can talk about, um, what is the importance of having structure and having systems and then integrating the individual and then being aware of who that person is and then playing to their strengths. So we're not just blanket stating, this is what we want, but we're
Mhm.
allowing people to shine through their individual strengths also.
Yeah. Well, like a perfect example would be when we're working with a sales team.
Yeah.
And so that sales team, they've all been trained on a certain sales methodology. And so, but they're still not hitting their sales targets and they don't know why. So they'll bring us in and say, okay, how can we amplify? How can we get a better result out of our people? And what we do is we're not telling them to go away from the sales training. The sales training is the structure. But what we're going to do is what I call moneyballing it, right? Like that 20%, that winning formula. Um, how do we unlock the hidden potential in that individual? So we then make it theirs. So you have a script and a messaging and of the steps of how to work through a prospect conversation that you've been taught through your sales methodology. But here's the thing, that sales methodology, whatever it is probably been trained. How many people have been trained on that? Millions.
Yeah. Yes.
So your sellers are super predictable, but they're not memorable. So they're talking, they're saying they're going through the motions, they're going through the steps, but they're not getting the results. Why? Because they're not making it theirs. So what we're doing is we're teaching them how to take what they already have, the systems that are in place, the structures, but then how do we get them to be super clear and effective and memorable in those interactions? So that's what we're working on, that part, right? Like, how do we make it theirs? And that's a piece that most organizations don't do. They try to make everybody the same, and they sit there going, okay, well, we're measuring all this, this, and this. I'm like, yeah, but if you're measuring the number of calls and the right, but you don't understand that your interactions are missing the mark. So we review what their systems are. We understand that we're not trying to change the way that you're talking about the business, et cetera, but you have to also understand that it's not just how you're showing up as the individual, uniquely you, but then also understanding, and this is what we teach in the programs, what I call the new ROI. I think I mentioned it in the book, but return on interactions, right? That same idea of like how you're making money versus losing money in every conversation. So how do you show up as you, but then understanding how the person you're talking to is listening, and understanding how there's different types of people. Not everybody thinks like you. So not everybody thinks like you. And so how do you read the room? How do you quickly know which words? Like, if you're familiar with love language, have you heard of love language before?
Yes.
Everybody has their own love language. And so what we teach within the frameworks is then how do you then infuse it by reading the person or the group of people that you're interacting with or selling to, how do you quickly meet them and say the words that they need to hear first? And so you're really tuned into the interaction. And that's how we just amplify the already existing systems that are in place and for the teams. It's just taking it and giving it a facelift,
Yeah.
measuring what matters.
Yes. And so this is so incredibly important for people to hear, because one of the things that I don't think people say enough, which I always say, is leadership is hard. It is not easy. The amount of work that it takes to be an extraordinary leader, most people are not signing up for that. What they're signing up for are the perks of leadership. Like, they see a leader with like nice stuff and they're like, why can't I get that stuff? And then we're comparing, but you're not comparing the work that is required for that leader to constantly and consistently evolve themselves and get
Right.
better at, doing the hard work. And so I love this conversation, because if you're a strong leader, like, the work never stops. But then it's also for you to be self-aware, to pause in those moments of looking at your people and saying, I need to teach structure, but then I also need to look at people and see that they are all individuals, and how can I maximize them as a person together in a whole company? And that is hard. It is not easy,
Right.
but
Well,
it's worth it. It's like the greatest work. My children go to a Montessori school, and that's actually the premise of Montessori. It's not to just train them to be robots, but to find their strengths and let them move into their strengths of what they like, what they work better with. And they teach them the basics, like, you need to learn how to read, you need to learn how to write, but then we're going to test out, what are you best at? So if we can talk about just why you need to spend the time with your people to know what their strengths are, as opposed to trying to make them be good at everything, because nobody's good at everything.
Right. Well, I'm absolutely. And I went to Montessori too, as a kid.
I can tell.
Yeah. So what was yes. So sorry, now I just forgot what you just asked.
No, it's just how do we know and stress the importance that I'm looking at an individual here. And
Oh,
while I have to give them the basics, I still have to focus on their strengths and not make them good at everything because
oh,
nobody is good at everything.
right, right. This is great. Thanks. You know that moment where you're like, you know what you're going to say, and then you forget. So how many times have you had a leader who was like, yeah, you're doing good, but this, and this, you're not doing well at. And so they're pointing out all the things you're doing wrong. And they're not pointing out anything you're doing right. I mean, I've had this when I would be I would be a top performer and they would just be, "Yeah, but you're just not that good." Right. And you're like, oh my God, do you know, like, that's like, it's behavioral science 101. Like, how do you want someone to continue to, go after it? We're going to just keep pulling them down. And I mean, it's like backwards. And, it's not leaders' faults because I really don't look at it as like it's leaders' faults because they're just completely unaware. And to your point, like most of them have been trained to do this from people who were taught leadership back in, when it was like, the machines, the
Factory workers. Yeah.
industry workers, right? Like
Yeah.
follow, right? And so it sounds like, oh my God, I don't want to learn about my people. I don't have the time for that. And my argument is, you don't have the time not to know that.
Mhm.
Because if you're going to have, over the course of, even just a month, how many conversations with someone, if you don't even know the most fundamental thing about what motivates them and drives them, you're the leader who's speaking, but nobody's listening,
Yeah.
right? You can't lead people if they're not listening, and they're not going to listen if they don't think that you understand them or know what they care about. It's just basics. So the simple thing of even asking, like, what motivates you? What drives you? Um, you usually we like to pair this. I love assessments, um, doing assessments around people's strengths so they can kind of see their strengths. But it's like, what are you motivated by? Really? And then you ask them, and hopefully they have an answer. Sometimes they don't. But that, what motivates you? What drives you? Some people need a kick in the ass. Some people need a pat on the back. Not everybody's driven by money.
Yeah.
People are
Definitely.
shocked by that. I'm like, no, especially this younger generation. They want to have meaning. They want to be doing meaningful work. They want to work for someone who is helping them grow. They want to be learning new things. Like that's what drives them. And so you could try to be the best leader, but you're missing the mark because you haven't asked the most foundational questions. I say it's like you're building a house, right? That's where you're trying to go, and you're worried about the third floor fancy bathroom fixtures, but you haven't even set and understand like what grounds them, what's their foundation. And so it's the most basic things. We're sort of helping people to get clear on for themselves and to get leaders to then understand that from their people. Right? How do we get super clear on this individual and how do we get the most out of them? A simple question, what motivates you?
Yeah.
Second question, yeah.
And this is not to, demonize leaders because leaders, we're human beings. We
Mhm.
make mistakes and it takes time for us to get better. And so this is a very important thing for people to understand that like we all have work to do. Even people that come into a company, if it's not perfect for you, it doesn't mean that it's the worst company in the world. It just means that we need to do some work here. And so
Mhm.
I think that's important that it needs to be said. When you go into an organization, like what brings you there? Is it the leader reaching out for help, or is it an issue that's causing them to reflect and then forcing them to get help? Like what is making someone reach out?
Well, we know that ideally you want to be how do I call it? It's like we want to be fire prevention,
Yes.
right? That's perfect. But what really usually what people come to you is like when the fire, like they need to put the
Yeah.
fire out,
They need
right? That
water.
they need water. And so it's usually like we have an urgent issue and either we're not hitting our numbers, we have, we either don't have, we have a lot of turnover. Our people are just, we feel like they're not engaged. Oftentimes it's like some other type of trigger event too, like they merge teams as a reorganization. We get a lot also where they're going, oh my gosh, we really don't have a real true leadership program to amp, that like specifically, we'll do it for sales and like there's different, leadership is there's different flavors of it. We typically get in usually either through referral because it's somebody that's either worked with me or somebody that worked with me referred me to somebody. So that's typically um, you know, coming in. And again, it's about how do we, at the end of the day, teaching them how to reframe and think about how to measure what matters instead of like measuring everything and helping them to see that these foundational steps to bringing out the best in their people is something that's repeatable and can be done and be taught. So once we teach leaders how to do this, and it's a practice, right? It's an ongoing practice of how they're showing up and meeting their people where they are.
Yeah, love this. Okay. You say some great one-liners in your book also that I wanted to like dig into, but you said we repeat what we don't repair. And, just for us to understand that that's why you should be so excited about doing the hard work, because if you don't do the hard work up front, it's going to cost you in just you repeating the same errors
Yes.
over and over again. So,
Mhm.
what would you say are things that are just incredibly important for people to start doing the repairing on? Like, what as individuals are affecting this? And this is not just in business and in sales. I believe, just talking to people that are at a grocery store, or if I'm doing my hair and I'm talking to my hair person, you know, people are hurting right now. And it's just, I don't know if it's something in the air or the atmosphere, but there seems to be a lot of it going around, or maybe we're just vocal more than we were before.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that needs to be done on people. Why should we take an interest in going back and repairing some of the things? And then the second part of that question is, how important is it the people that we actually talk to help and aid with our repairs? Because could
Mm.
we be talking to the wrong people that are just giving us more destruction?
Right. So I would say like you can't we'll repeat what we don't repair, but it's about being present and having acknowledgement and awareness of why you are where you are. What are the decisions that you've made today? And
Yeah.
just being, and taking responsibility. Like every decision that you've made has got you to exactly where you are today. Now you can't go back, right? It's like I think it's Wayne Dyer who says this. If you're familiar with Wayne Dyer,
Yep.
yeah. And he talks about it's like the weight in a boat. And it's like all the stuff behind you. Like that, like it's like, okay, you've done this, but where are you going? You don't focus on the wake to get to the direction where you want to go. You want to get clear and okay, what are the things that who do I want to become? What do I want? Like what inspires me? One of the most helpful questions I ask people that I coach is like, who's someone you admire and why? Could be anybody. Actually, let me ask you. Who is there? Is there someone that you admire?
Yeah. Jesus.
Okay.
Mhm.
Tell me specifically what about Jesus? Um, what is it about it? What is it about? Tell me a little bit more. Give me a little more detail.
It was his conviction and courage that he had because he knew he was on a mission that was greater than himself. And
Mhm.
so every interaction he had with, just whether it was someone who was a high priest that could be intimidating, or it was someone who was really at the lowest point of their life where they needed help and people would just turn away from them. He was always looking at them and saying like, I'm not here for just myself. I'm here to live a better way, to demonstrate, to show that to
Mhm.
people. And so everything he did wasn't about his personal self-interest. It was
Mhm.
about let me be a representation of a greater way to be.
Okay. So everybody that's listening right now that knows you, uh, what you just described is how you show up, right? Conviction, courage, on a mission, turning towards people. You just said that, right? It's like, how do you talk to somebody in the coffee shop? And so what I tell people is like when you write that down and you think about what, because it wasn't just Jesus, right? Because if I asked, that's why I said specifics, because you could have gone in a million different directions. That's uniquely what is the message for you? And so when you do that, what you can know that is, okay, when I have to make a hard decision, because I'm a leader and I'm always going to have to make a hard decisions, say, what would Jesus do? Right. And so you can go, okay, let me think about, if I think about everything that I just explained, like it gives you a velocity, like a direction and velocity to be able to, how do you think about hard things when you're in the moment? Um, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think that is why we need to have great conversations with great people. Yeah.
And so that's like like a very simple thing to always come back to, right? Like, what do I do in this moment? Because that person, and we typically do like values exercises with people because like their people's core values, most people, that's like one of the foundational things that people don't know their own.
Yeah.
And so when you understand your core value, you also then understand when you pair that up with the person that you admire, you will know and see that there is a correlation. There's almost always a correlation. And so that we can know that what we're trying to get you to do, if you're a leader, how do you lead people? By connecting. How they trust you and being clear in who you are and being clear in who you're not. You're not apologizing and trying to be who you're not, right? We dropped the 80%. So we're honing in on who you are and then how you're using that, your values, your strengths, who you admire, like this whole combination of behavioral data we pull and self data and all these insights to help you build your leadership language. We call it your leadership language. So this is like your leadership Bible of where are the areas, like how do you communicate, how do you stay within this, because this is how you think, behave, this is what you value. And so but just something as simple as asking that question is, who do I admire, how do I stay aligned to that, is going to help you you know step more into the direction you want to be versus where you don't want to be.
Yeah. Huge.
Another technique that is very effective is because you want to understand, right? Part of being a leader is like, is the person listening? What are they listening for? So another technique that you can use is at the end of every conversation, every interaction, whether it's with someone on your team, whether it's a client, you can say, was this a good interaction? Like, was this a good use of our time? And so I'll just role play it with you if you're okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
You're like, I didn't know we are going to role play. So
No, I'm
Sabrina,
down for that.
I love it. Okay. Love it. Okay. So Sabrina, was this a good conversation? Was this helpful? Did you?
Yeah, I think it was very helpful. I think for me, these are things that I don't often think about, and it's forcing me to ask questions of myself that I never asked before.
Awesome. So I really value your feedback, and I'm appreciative to be here. But what specifically, is there one thing that I said specifically that stood out?
Um, Let me see. What has stood out the most to me is I think it's just working on our strengths, to really look at the individual and build them up instead of always pointing out what people do wrong, because then that gets them, on a behavioral basis. Like it's not getting them focused in the right direction. Like we're putting a negative energy. And that doesn't mean we can't talk about that, but we can talk about what they can do to get better, but then finish with the strengths. Like what are you good at? So
Yes.
we're pulling people in a direction of wanting to continue instead of deflating them.
Yes, because you've built a foundation of strength with them. So
Yeah.
back to the beginning where you said, like, you said something in the beginning. It might have been before we jumped on. to start recording, but it was something about like how, you really advocate for people. Like, how are you helping to build them up? But absolutely. So you just said what you heard out of this conversation so far. And so with all the listeners who are listening, each of them, there's something different that they pulled out.
Mhm.
And so why it's so important in every interaction is to ask that question. The same way that if you and I were having an employee leader conversation, it's not about what I say, but it's what you heard.
Yeah, definitely.
And so then I write that down. And so you focused on the strengths in the individual and how to point that out. So now I know that that's something that you're like, oh, that's important. I want to get better at that. So every time I'm talking to you in the future, it's like, okay, well, how are you working on understanding your own strengths? But then how do you pull those out of others? And so when you take the moment to ask your employee in that employee conversation or with a client, was this a helpful meeting? Was this a helpful one-on-one? Yes. What was most helpful? You ask them, you have them think about it, and then you write it down. Because then the next one-on-one, what direction do we want to go in? You could have, it's an open ocean, right? Of all the different avenues. But it's like, oh, you said last time that you really, it was important to understand how to pull out the strengths. So, what have you worked on with that? Is there anything specific to so I'm basically repeating back to you what you need, right? So that's a technique you can use in any conversation at the end of any conversation.
Yeah, and it also shows that like you care to hear what people are hearing, and then you are,
Yes.
you're doing a follow-up with it so that it's not just general conversations all the time and it's a conversation on purpose. For us to like tie this all together, I think one of the things I experience in the business world is a lack of humility and a ton of ego. And if we can tie this all together and conclude, like, why are those two qualities that you've got to get in check for yourself? Because you're never going to be self-aware if there's ego that's blocking you from seeing what's really there. And we all have blind spots. Sometimes our ego doesn't make us ask for help from like stronger people than us. We're just surrounding ourselves with other weak voices to like reinforce like the victim that we are. And so that's
Right.
not helpful. And you have to
Right.
have great humility, even as you like raise in your level to know, like, I don't have all the answers. I'm still working on myself. Like I'm still getting better. And then just sometimes just ask for forgiveness for like your past behaviors, because none of us are perfect. We've done things. So, what can we do that is just growing a culture? This is what I love about business. I get to grow a team of people that we ultimately have trust in one another,
Mhm.
where we're in this together and we have no ego. There's great sense of humility. Whenever there's people around me with no humility and a ton of ego, I'm like, get away from me. I can't, there's a wall there that I'm not going to be able to penetrate because you can't even penetrate it. Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's where that sort of historical leadership philosophy of putting the wall up, the ego up, um, you're you're working against results with
Yeah.
that. That's war room leadership because people aren't going to trust you. And if you think about it in every interaction, if you're in sales, if you want to sell something, if someone doesn't trust you
Yeah.
because they can tell that you're not being who you are, you're not going to get those deals. And so this is why, as a competitive advantage for any organization that is looking to help reframe, how do we show up as leaders? How do we show up as the most real version of ourselves? Because that's what attracts people to you,
Yeah.
right? I mean, people buy from people. And yes, we have, our systems and we have our technology, but the challenge is that we're looking for how to automate everything. And if you still have to have people in your organization, you're paying them, you got to understand what motivates and drives them. How do you get them at their best? How do you get them to perform their best when it matters most? And that again goes back to measuring what matters. And traditionally, we have measured all these other things that don't matter as much as what we're talking about here. The core of that individual, we talk about culture. what is culture? Everybody says they want a good culture. They want team trust. And I'm like, all that is, all culture is a compounded interest of every interaction between every team member over and over again. That is culture. That is the way we show up. So we want to be more learn it all, less know it all, right? The ego is the enemy. That's a great book. But what I talk about in the book too is this traditional leadership style. Leaders would rather be right than win. And so you see a lot of organizations that are just they're drowning and people are unhappy because there's all ego. And so this is an opportunity to change the game, right? Like, how do we measure what matters? How do we be less predictable, more memorable? And when we do that and we train leaders and how to sort of come back to who they are and their
Mhm.
uniqueness, everything rises.
Yeah, that's so great. Where can people go to find out more about you, about your services, and just connecting with you so that they can like do the work so that they can get the ball rolling?
Oh, I always say LinkedIn. LinkedIn is like my place to go because then you can at least see other people I know, right? And then you can check out and check before you talk to me. But yeah, LinkedIn's great, or my website, infirstconsulting.com. But yeah, LinkedIn's usually I think the best because that's where you, again, like it's all relationships, right? You want to work with people, good know good people. You want to work with people that you trust. And I really do. I say this all the time is like you really have to do your work in making sure that the people that you're bringing in, and working with, like they've been in the trenches, they get it. There's a lot of people out there that do coaching and training and that haven't actually been in in the situations, in the real stuff, right? I
Yeah.
talk about like real stuff. Like a lot is around theory, like this, like theorists, right? I'm like a realist. Like this is how what really happens versus what they say, how it looks good on paper. But when you're dealing with real hard stuff and real people, like this is how focusing on these things, areas that most are not looking at, are going to help you as a business to exponentially grow people, grow performance. So
Yeah.
yes, LinkedIn, you can check me out.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a great pleasure. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy.
You.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.